Most leaders don't realize that the way they handle workplace conflict is quietly signaling to their teams and to senior leadership that they're not ready for higher responsibility. As an executive coach, I've spent over 3,000 hours coaching leaders across Fortune 500 companies through workplace conflict. And what I've seen over and over again is capable leaders quietly losing trust, credibility, and even promotion opportunities because of how they handle it, even when they believe they're doing the right thing by giving their team space to work things out themselves. So, in this video, I'll introduce you to my trademarked collaborative conflict model that identifies the four most common types of workplace conflict so you can start recognizing what's actually happening beneath the surface and understand why some conflicts escalate while others don't. When conflict shows up on your team, you want to empower people. You definitely don't want to micromanage. So, what do most leaders do? They tell them, you need to work this out yourselves, figure it out. Or maybe you pull one person aside, hear their version, and hope the other person comes around. Or you send a quick message to the team saying, let's all stay professional. Or you wait a few days thinking maybe it'll just blow over on its own. But that hands off approach has a big problem. It doesn't signal trust, it signals abandonment. Because without support or structure, the conflict rarely disappears. Instead, it evolves. A simple disagreement becomes something deeper and harder to untangle. And when senior leadership sees that, they're not thinking, great delegator. They're thinking, if they can't step in and understand what's actually breaking down here, why would we trust them to lead at the next level? But as I'm about to show you, most leaders struggle with conflict not because they lack authority, but because they're misreading the type of conflict they're actually dealing with. This is the collaborative conflict model. There are four most common types of workplace conflict. And the first thing to understand is that conflict itself isn't the problem. Conflict is actually information. It's the system signaling that something needs attention. Once you understand which type of conflict you're looking at, the entire situation starts to make more sense. It's the same framework I use with Fortune 500 clients to help leaders make sense of conflicts that previously felt chaotic. And here's something most leaders completely miss about these four types. They don't stay in one category, and that matters more than most people realize. So, process conflict. This first type is the easiest to recognize, and it's the one many leaders accidentally escalate because they misinterpret what's actually happening. Process conflict is about the work itself. It's about requirements, deliverables, timelines, capacity. What it sounds like is we don't have enough time. This deadline is unrealistic. I wasn't told about this step. So listen for logistics and workflow language. This isn't about people, it's about the work and how it moves. One of my acquisition clients started here with process conflicts. There were different meeting norms, different timelines, different assumptions about how the work should happen. At the surface level, it looked like simple coordination issues. When leaders can recognize process conflict early, they prevent the team from interpreting logistical friction as something personal. And that ability, seeing the system clearly, is something senior leadership notices immediately. So that's process conflict, often the most visible and the most misunderstood. But sometimes what looks like a process issue isn't really about the what, it's about the who. This is role conflict. So the second type of conflict, role conflict, is where many leaders get stuck. Because even when the workflow gets clarified, the tension doesn't disappear. Role conflict is territorial. It's about ownership and authority. What it sounds like is, that's not my job, or I thought I was leading this, or why wasn't I included? Listen for possessive language. It's my, mine, ours. This is about boundaries and influence. In my acquisition client example, the conflict shifted here. The former leader of an acquired company began to feel her territory shrinking. What had once been her team now felt shared or contested. And once that dynamic appears, the conversation changes. Leaders who can recognize role conflict early show something important. They understand about power and how power and accountability move inside an organization. That's a director level capability. Now, you might be thinking real conflicts aren't this clean, and you're right. But most conflicts still have a primary driver underneath the noise. And when leaders learn to recognize that driver, the situation becomes much easier to understand. So, if you've looked at the process and clarified the roles, many conflicts settle down. But sometimes the tension is still there. And that's because conflict has moved somewhere else entirely. Now we're talking about story conflict. This third type is the most common because human beings are constantly telling themselves stories. Story conflict is about interpretation, the narrative someone creates to explain what they think is happening. So, what it sounds like is she's trying to make me look bad, or he doesn't respect my work, or they don't care about this project. Listen for assumptions and generalizations and character judgments. By the time my acquisition client came to me, both sides had developed very different stories. They were things like the old guard doesn't respect us. The new leadership doesn't understand how we work. Once a conflict reaches this level, the facts are no longer the only thing shaping the conversation. The story people believe begins influencing their behavior. Leaders who can recognize when a conflict has shifted into narrative territory demonstrate something rare: the ability to read between the lines of what people say. That's a skill that separates operational leaders from strategic ones. Before I show you the fourth type of conflict, if you're dealing with a conflict situation right now and want help diagnosing which type you're facing, I'm offering a free consultation call where I'll walk you through the same framework I use with my Fortune 500 clients to analyze what's actually happening inside the conflict. The link is in the description. All right, back to the video. So, those are the three most common types of conflict. But here's what many leaders don't realize: conflicts don't stay in one category, they evolve. A missed deadline, which would be process, becomes you don't respect my time, which becomes role. Then it goes to you're unreliable, which is story. And eventually that becomes you don't belong on this team. And that's when conflict reaches the fourth level: identity conflicts. This fourth type is the most serious and the most costly when leaders fail to recognize it early. Identity conflict isn't about what someone did, it's about who someone is perceived to be. What it sounds like is she's incompetent, he's toxic, they don't belong here. Listen for labels. Once those appear, the conflict is moved into territory that can affect culture, retention, and even trust. In my acquisition client's case, the conflict was approaching this level when she reached out to me. At that point, the stakes were no longer just about work coordination. The entire team dynamic was at risk. Leaders who can recognize identity level conflict understand when a situation is no longer a simple disagreement. They're able to see when the health of the team and sometimes the organization is at stake. And that level of judgment is exactly what executive leadership is looking for. So, those are the four types of workplace conflict: process, role, story, and identity. The critical leadership skill isn't avoiding conflict, it's recognizing what kind of conflict you're actually looking at before it escalates. Because the longer conflict evolves without intervention, the more complicated it becomes. And the collaborative conflict model isn't just useful for team disagreements. Leaders use it to understand cross functional tension, post merger culture clashes, difficult peers, even conflict with their own boss. But here's the real shift: anyone can react to conflict. But great leaders learn to recognize the patterns behind it. That's exactly what I'll show you in the next video. So go watch that next, where I'll walk you through a real situation where one leader used this model to break through after being stuck with the same conflict tension for over a year.